conducted for an oral history project on the 60s and the Chicana civil rights movement. The project consisted of interviewing an individual who was in Texas or Mexico or in Mexico during the decade of the 1960s. The interviews focused on the period of the civil rights movement, drawing out the personal experience of interviewees about events they found personally significant or culturally dramatic. Panelists will address the dynamics and effects of the Chicana experience, addressing issues as social identity, educational experience, and activism during the historical period of the 60s. To get us started, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Keta Miranda, Director of the Mexican-American Studies program at the University of Texas at San Antonio.
Thank TACHE for the invitation to participate. Mexican-American Studies is, from the Chicano Studies, lives the legacy of the Chicano civil rights movement. Our course in Introduction to Chicano Studies, we read David Montejano's Quixote Soldiers, and as a result, the students then reflect on the kinds of things that were happening in the 60s and then begin to look at the kinds of projects. I think, again, given the role and mission of TACHE, the fact that identity is so important to education, and identity is not simply one's discovery of the self, but really for many of our students to see, to find, and find the kinds of representation based on their life experiences, their families' experiences, and in the core curricula within the university. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jacob Jimenez.
Buenos días a todos. Welcome. So like Dr. Keta said, we're basing our research off of David Montejano's book, Quixote Soldiers, and the person that I interviewed was my father, Jesse S. Jimenez. And he was born in 1959, and he attended Jefferson High School right as it got integrated for being an all-white school and integrating students of color, Black, Mexican-American on. So my mother at that time was also attending, and that's where they met. But my father was growing up in the Lucero Saldaña courts back in San Antonio, Texas, and that's where Jefferson High School is located in San Antonio, Texas. And growing up in the courts, Lucero Saldaña, Dr. Montejano's book talks about those courts and about the different gangs and the identities that were placed within the courts and kind of the groups that they had assimilated into, that formed into those gangs. And my father, upon interviewing him, his self-identity was that he was Mexican-American, but he never joined any gangs. He never joined any of those groups that had assimilated themselves in the courts into those various gang groups that were seen there. So when he first went into Jefferson High School, his primary language was Spanish. They spoke English, but it was only to other people outside of the home. In the home and amongst friends, it was primarily Spanish was their first language. And during the interview with him, he said that his teachers, the education system that he had previous to going into Jefferson High School, focused primarily on vocations, going into being an electrician, a plumber, working on cars, mechanics, and never really focused in on attending college or a higher education. And they were on the track system to go to either Burbank, Lanier, Fox Tech High School to attend one of these vocational programs and graduate with that vocation and go on to become that. So in attending Jefferson High School, I asked him if there was any racism, and the teachers shunned him for whatever reason because he was Mexican and couldn't speak. He said that they didn't. Was actually the opposite that occurred. His identity became more formed and seen himself as American, getting away from Mexican-American, and seeing himself as one identity, being American, with his English teacher primarily teaching him how to read and write English better, and how to pronunciate his words better. She would make him say something about chocolate and chicken, and because he pronounces ch and sh together, because Spanish was his primary first language, and that stuck with him, you know. And he said that was the greatest thing that ever happened to him, was learning how to speak. And he would go back to the courts and this new identity that he was assuming they would see him as the other, would ostracize him, and he could no longer be a part of that group. He would get bullied because of the way he was speaking. Now they said he was too pocho, too gringo for them, and didn't speak the right language, the right Spanish anymore. So his identity that he sees himself now is primarily American. He doesn't see himself as Mexican-American, and he says this is because he was assimilated at Jefferson High School. And the identity that he had, that I identify myself as Chicana. And I asked him, I was like, how do you feel about that, Dad? He's like, to me, you're just a rebel. He's like, you don't know what you're talking about. He's like, you're too much of a fighter. You're too Mexican for me. So I was like, well, you're too American for me, Dad. But it's an inside joke that we have with each other. But that's how my father grew up with me, and he never finished college. He went to St. Philip's to get his LVN, but he never finished, and he ingrained in me to go to college and to continue going even when I almost dropped out of college. And he said, look at my story, look at my life and all the hardships that I went through. And he's like, there's no way you're going to quit now after what I went through for you. So in my testimony for him, in the interview that I had with him, it's kind of an honor of his legacy that he instilled in me to continue on going to college, and that's why I'm attending grad school, because of what he's talking about, Mom and So that was my interview based off of Dr. Montejano's book, Quixote Soldiers, and my father, UTSA Jimenez.
Hi, my name is Lucero Saldaña, and we also had the same interview, different years and semesters. I interviewed my father actually. He's actually 66 years old. He was born in Mexico, but he considers himself Chicano because he was raised here in the States. His family actually moved from Mexico, Saltillo, all the way to Miranda, which is here in Texas, and they stayed here for a couple of years and then moved to California. Now, we do primarily focus on Texas, but we got interested on why move to California. What was so special about California? Why not stay here in Texas? So we were talking about the interviews, and we answered questions. We're like, Dad, why did we move to California? Like, why this family name? Why Saldaña? Why did Saldaña go to California? They're all in California. So finally, we kind of realized that jobs. We realized that our family needed, money to support themselves, and the way that was going to go was going to California, going to the fishing jobs over there. So we went to Rances Pass, where my grandma actually started off with canneries, and they did canned tuna, everything like that. And then we noticed that the jobs were gone. So after the jobs were gone, they went to California, and they focused more on the jobs over there, and they actually retired from that kind of business in California. And then another primary focus point where my family goes to is, I'm a Saldaña, and I'm here in Texas. How did that happen? It's like, I'm the only one. Why go to Texas? So we kind of noticed through my dad's history that he came actually to Mexico, and he was just focused on himself. He was like, okay, I'm just going to focus on myself. My dad is he is a musician. We have a generation going on through musicians. So one of his, buddies calls him. He's actually from Tyler, Texas. He goes, hey, Carlos, I need a bass player. Come over here. I need you this weekend. So my dad moves from Mexico all the way to Texas. And that's where he met my mom in a Catholic church. So we actually moved a lot from my name. We moved to Mexico, to Texas, California, Mexico again, and then Texas. So that's kind of the history through my dad right there. He was also involved with the Army in the 60s. He was actually drafted. It was kind of weird because he is Mexican. He was born in Mexico. But, he was drafted here in the United States. He's still not a citizen of the United States, but he says he was really proud to serve a country that was his second home, basically. It is his home. And he just kind of didn't really, he says, hey, I did my duty as well, I'm not a U.S. citizen, but I consider myself kind of like a U.S. citizen because I am Chicano. I was here. I saw what went on in California in school systems. No, I didn't graduate high school because I need to focus more towards working, having a job. But hey, that doesn't mean that you don't need to focus on education as well. So because of that, because of my dad's history moving all around, I am here. And I am here at UTSA. I'm the first person to graduate from high school out of my family, the first one to have an associate's degree, and this upcoming December I will be the first one to get my bachelor's as well.
Good afternoon, I'm Timothy Garcia-Giddens, and I'll also be talking about Montejano's Quixote soldiers. I had the opportunity to expand nuestra cultura and our conocimiento of that by interviewing my tío Lucero Garcia. He was born in 1947 in West Laco, Texas, the poorest county in the nation, and he grew up in those days, in the 40s, 50s, and became a young man in the 1960s era, and which was the Chicana movement era. As a young boy, he worked migrant fields of East and West Texas, as far up north as Michigan, Minnesota, and as he grew older, he became involved in the movement by working with Vista volunteers, which were volunteers in service to America. I'm not sure, maybe some of you are familiar with that. And basically, because of his political activism and his organizing, that was the reason why I chose to interview him for our Oral History project. And currently, he lives in Laredo, and he does have a secondary residence in Rio Bravo. Ironically, the same fields that he used to work and cultivate as a young boy under the age of 10, which is, for a lot of us going to college, we can't experience that, and we can't share in that. So it was very emotional, and I enjoyed it very much. Some of the significant things that he said about the movement that struck, a chord in my mind were the fact that the socioeconomic, the discrimination issues, the conditions of inequity and inequality, that really helped shape how he became a young man, later an older man, as he matured. Some things he told me about his experience on the field really blew my mind. He comes from a family of 11, actually 12 brothers and sisters. One died at birth. And one tenant that they worked for, and he was only, I guess he told me like 8, he told me that they offered, and this was a white family that owned the farm or the field that they worked on. He told me that they offered to trade a pig for his younger brother, Betito, and I don't know how that makes you all feel, but that made me, it touched me very much. He did mention to me that barrio organizing, first led by the NYC, the National Youth Council, and later he organized and worked with the Vista volunteers. What it did for him, as Montejano touches on in his book about barrio organizing, is it led him from hanging out with his friends in the vatos, as Montejano typifies, and from working these random jobs that didn't pay anything. He worked at gas stations, he worked at all types of vocational jobs growing up, in addition to being a field worker, migrant worker. And it led him to become more politically active and into this organizing world. The most astonishing part is he only had a 5th grade education, and we learned as Chicanos, the classroom setting, that the conditions weren't equal. He told me that they would just set them aside, not even teach them. So given that fact that he had very little education, he politically, he ascended to the political ranks in Laredo as a young man, is very motivating for me. Working with Vista, he attested how they mobilized, they educated, and they organized their barrios. They didn't depend on somebody else from the outside to come and tell them what to do. They themselves, we more so organized those neighborhoods. And what they were doing in Laredo, I don't know how many of you are from Laredo or even know the situation politically in Laredo. But over our history, maybe until the late 70s or early 70s, we had what was called a patron system, patronismo. And Laredo was under the rule of the Martins. And what Vista did, and the local organizations there that were working with Vista, actually they were, as he depicted it, they were really Casa Unida, but they were working under the visage of Vista. And they mobilized to end the patron system in Laredo, and they did end the patron system. Mayor Pepe Martin, back in the 70s, his rule ended, and they elected a mayor, Aldo Tangelo. I think he was a Republican, and ironically, they voted, those people voted him out of office. The last most impressionable thing that he told me before I close the with is that if he would have had it his way, if he would have been able to, have better educational conditions or not having to be a migrant farm worker or what have you, he would have loved to finish school and become a lawyer. And ironically, I say ironically because I'm hoping to become a lawyer or go to graduate school, but the thing that he wanted as a child and couldn't, aspire to or to get realistically, I'm doing the same thing and following along in his footsteps. So, in a sense, he's living vicariously through me, and I hope that I could help him realize his dreams that way. And finally, in closing, my reflection of my field, as I said, he was an everyman, having little formal education, growing up in the gringo schools of East and West Texas. Despite all this lack of education and through his lived experiences, his organizing, his mobilizing, he understood the implications of the Chicana movement, and he understood that the root of all these problems that we still experience today, disparate educational circumstances, racial discrimination, civil and political inequality, he didn't know how to articulate it in such a manner, but he knew what he was talking about, and he knew that he was fighting for the people. And the reason he became an activist and he worked with Vista was so he could help people. He's never asked for help from anybody, but he always offers help to whoever. For example, many of his employees over the years have been immigrants that weren't, or as the state calls them, illegal immigrants, but as I call them, they're humans, and he saw that as well, and he helped employ them in such a manner. And that's what I learned from him, because I worked with him during the summers, and the business network that he built, or that he served in his community in Laredo now, mainly labor work, manual vocation. He built his network through Vista, and ascending to the ranks of organizing, mobilizing, or whatnot. And working with him, I learned his hard work ethic and this level, or this notion of humility, and pretty much, he got all this from the movement. So that's why I'm going to read my deal notes. Thank you very much.
All right, next, we also will have Dr. Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. She'll share about the project they did at the University of Texas at Austin in her class. So, Dr.
Thank you. Glad to be here today, and I love what they're doing at UTSA. Our project has been around since 1999. It started off as the U.S. Latino and Latina World War II Oral History Project. It started because when I was a reporter, before I became an academic, I was a reporter and I wrote a magazine story about Mexican Americans in Texas in World War II, and I found a huge gap in the literature. And so that motivated us to, several years later, we began an oral history project to try to create the primary materials so that we could do the research on them. So it's kind of interesting hearing you all talk about your project and your work, because what they're doing is they're building primary materials that are going to be able to result in some more publications later on, which is really exciting. I had dinner some months ago with a graduate student at UT who's from China, and his dissertation topic was about a vase. A vase. A Chinese vase, an ancient Chinese vase. And I told him, I wouldn't even know where to start on something like this. I mean, you kind of have to start from scratch. Like our oral history project, a lot of times some of the topics that we look at, we are starting from scratch because we don't have a lot of that foundational literature to lean on. And he said, oh no, actually this has been researched. There's many, many books and many journal articles about this space. That struck me as what an opportunity, but also how much work we have ahead of us. If there are more books about one Chinese face than there are about our history, after all that we've contributed to our country, to our state, to our communities, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And thank God that we have young people with energy who are going to guide us there. One thing that George asked me to talk a little bit about the connection to the curriculum and how that can be different. I teach journalism. I was a journalist for a long time. I teach journalism. The class that I teach is called Journalism is Oral History, or Oral History is Journalism, depending on what semester I'm talking about. But really, oral history can, as you all know, can be used in English, you can use it in history, in anthropology. It really is applicable to just about every discipline. In fact, as I was hearing you talk, I haven't seen a good oral history of social workers. And social workers have played such a key role in the Chicana movement. It would be fascinating to see that. So what we do is we write stories, and for us, I teach undergraduates mostly, but also the occasional graduate student, at least 2 graduate students whenever I teach this class. And what they learn is they learn the history of the period, but then they learn how to incorporate this into a news story. So for me, it fits very well into what I hope our students do, is to use archival material to inform their journalistic, their reporting, because that way you can have all that background, the social context that oftentimes, I hate to say it, but oftentimes our journalistic treatments are missing. The other thing that we do is our project really does cultivate some seeds. Over and over again, I only brought a couple of these of our newsletters, but I'll be glad to give them to us. They are on our website, which you'll see up here if somebody will just tap the keyboard. It's voicesoralhistoryproject.org, and on there there's testimonials from some of our graduate students. And what they do is, as they're reading about Mexican Americans, Latinos of World War II, we've expanded to Korea and Vietnam, we're planting some seeds. And what they're seeing is they're seeing a connection between present day events and history of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this is really powerful for them because they're able to see that whatever is going on today didn't start today. It really has antecedents way back when. The other part that they're doing is they are creating some political awareness. One of my students, in 2007, I don't know how many of y'all remember this, but in 2007, PBS was getting ready to launch a huge documentary by Ken Burns. It was going to be 14 and a half hours long, and we found out for different reasons, different ways that there were no Latinos in this documentary. So we launched an organization called defendthehonor.org, and our students became politically aware. The ones that were taking my class at the time started thinking, why is it that we are left out of the historical accounts of our country? One of our students ended up going and doing her master's at Texas State, and wrote her master's thesis about the Ken Burns omission. And it's really interesting because when I first met her as an undergraduate, she was not politically aware. She was just kind of like, just happened to be there. And as she became more and more aware of all the work that was to be done, her eyes just got bigger and bigger, and that's what she's working on her PhD now at Arizona State. So for our students, they're getting that little seed of awareness that I think is going to reap big time. And for our students up here, I know that I can see where they're going. It's really exciting. And I'll end with this. we got a big grant once upon a time, and with this grant we were able to travel around, and we went to Laredo Community College twice, and we did a bunch of interviews. Dr. Maldonado was kind enough to make the library available to us, so we did several interviews there. But one of the places we went was also Kansas City, and we interviewed this man, World War II vet, named Mike Morado. And after the interview, Mike Morado wrote a little note to the graduate student who interviewed him and said, "Dear Valerie, thank you so much for interviewing me. You made me feel important." And we looked at that and we read this note and we said, how sad is that this is a World War II veteran, a man who's given so much over and over again, and it's taken sitting in front of a video camera for him to feel important. So for my students and for me, I kind of have a new way of looking at this, is that we should hopefully make everybody, all our Latino brothers and sisters, feel that whatever they do is important. And regardless if it's just a little thing and you say, I could have done better than that, well, maybe so, but it's a contribution. It's something that's there now that wasn't there yesterday. So one of my big things is, I never want to say again, I'm the daughter of a barber, my mother's a housewife, I grew up thinking that white women, white housewives, were like Donna Reed with the pearls around their neck and doing their vacuuming with high heel shoes. And my mother was descalza when she was mopping. And I remember thinking, growing having this idea that I was from a humble, a modest background, and no more do I ever say that, and I never have thought that, because my parents were able to do a lot with what they had. So I hope that if I leave you with one little thing is, let's take the modest and humble out of our vocabulary. We come from amazing, remarkable people, and we need to let them know how amazing and remarkable they are, and how amazing and remarkable we are. Because only when we do that are we able to really make some major changes.
Thank you to the students and faculty for their remarkable work in making sure that the stories, as well as the students and the community, is able to learn from them. We have a couple of minutes if there are any questions for the panel, for the students, or the faculty in regards to their program or their experience. Does anybody have any questions for them? Yes.
Just one more thing for anyone. Is there report from the parents or whoever you interviewed just now? Do they regret the life they lived?
My father is, in his conclusion, in the ending of my interview process was he never regretted anything. The only thing he did regret was that he didn't go on to finish his LVN and actually get a licensed RN as he had planned to. But as far as growing up in the courts and going through the federal government aid and graduating from Jefferson High School, there was no regrets. And like I said, my legacy and my sister's legacy is continuing what he couldn't finish for him.
Personally, my deal, when I asked him about, how does he feel or about his life, he had no regrets, simply. But then I asked him, how do you feel, or how do you identify then, and how did you identify then, and how do you identify now? And he said, then pues I was Mexicano, but then I became Chicano. And now again, he's Mexicano, and he has no regrets about that whatsoever. And I asked him, so how do you feel that I claim the identity of Chicano? And he was like, you don't know how it makes me feel that, everything that we did in those days, there's still young people that have that fire and passion for activism. So, no regrets.
With my dad, it's that same thing. He has no regrets at all. The only thing he does wish he did focus more was at the school, because he did focus a lot on supporting his family, especially his brothers and sisters and his mom at the time. But yeah, he wants to actually graduate high school. He wants to get his GED. And he's trying to focus towards that right now. Actually, he's talking about it a little bit more. So even though he is 66, he plans to get that eventually. Okay.
Any other questions? Comments?
I don't have a question, I just have a suggestion. In the summer of 1970, Stanford University hosted a Chicano Studies seminar. There hasn't been one since. The National Endowment for the Humanities regularly funds programs where high school teachers, community college teachers, university faculty can come together around a topic or a theme. I've never seen one of those. But this seems very, very appropriate. About 2-3 years ago, we had Miranda talking about his project in the valley, UT Brownville, doing oral history in South Texas. We've had Maggie for years. She told you how long it's been. There's a new project on Lucero Saldaña. This is just Texas. I've done some work with Montejano Voices. You can just Google that. But perhaps TACHE might want to get behind an initiative to sponsor National Endowment for the Humanities. That's a grant. And since we have FaceTime and internet, we don't have to be at Laredo Community College or here. We can be anywhere. And anybody can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be 30 people. It could be 300 of us. So we can learn all of these resources and have an intensive course, so we can then become teachers ourselves, not just researchers and so on.
The accounts are amazing. The interviews and the way that you all shared them, just straight voices and not shuddering a bit. And I just have to, I can imagine how that made you feel, what you learned through this project, how that made you feel, and that's very deep and personal and internal, and I can respect that. I was wondering how it changed you. What's happened since?
I guess just, I have a daughter, she's 2 years old, and the first thing I told my wife was, she's going to look at me and see me, who are going being a graduate student with my master's, my bachelor's that I have. And she's going to look at the history of my ancestors that have come before me and the paths that they've blazed and my path that I'm blazing for her and my child that's coming. And the legacy that I want to leave behind is not just education, but the empowerment of identity, the empowerment of knowing where you stand not only in the world and the city that you live in, but in knowing where you stand in the presence of the universe, in the presence of what you're putting forth out for the people to see and hear. And that's something that my father has taught me, and going through Jefferson High School and how his identity has changed. I might not agree with him that he says he's American and doesn't see himself as Mexican. I mean, it's just, that's his identity. But, my daughter's identity might be something completely different. It might come up with a new word. I don't know. It's I'm Chicano, and I'll always be Chicano. Maybe it might change when I'm 50. I don't know. But that's something that, it's an evolution of learning. It's an evolution of epistemology, of knowledge that's constantly evolving. And that's something that's beautiful about these conferences, about us gathering here together. It's not saying, oh, where do we go? It's no, it's what are we doing to get to where we're going and then the next step forward.
Well, for one, I learned a lot from the Oral History Project. I thought I knew it all. Thought my dad was a musician. Yeah, I heard about it. I heard the stories before. Dad went to California. He came back. Oh, he played over here. He played over there. He was involved with almost getting a record deal with Sony in California. I thought I heard it all. And then that one question, Dr. Miranda said, why did he move to California? I didn't know that. I mean, you realize as Latinos and Hispanics here, we don't know our true history. We know what country we come from, but that struggle that our parents or our grandparents even made, we don't know that until you go and interview a person. Or like Dr. Miranda, she had an oral history project. That just changed me. I was like, oh wow, like my dad had to go through this. My grandma had to go through this. His siblings, uncles and aunts, we have to do this. I mean, that just changed me because I was like, well, we're here in the United States. It's the land of dreams. We can do whatever we want. I mean, they couldn't do whatever they needed. They had to focus on jobs, focus on their families. But for me, my dreams are endless. I mean, I'm thinking about grad school already. Let's go to higher education. Nothing will stop me. I mean, we need to focus to that, like to our children right now, especially. Because in my hometown, I was just telling Dr. Miranda that in our ride up here. I mean, the focus over there is in education. It's like, oh, let's get married. Let's get having a family. Let's get a good job. We need to focus through education, because with that, we can do anything we need to.
Briefly, I know time's running out. Just to reiterate and to reinforce what they said, of course it's, considered, or it's given me more motivation and drive to succeed. I've gotten that also from my mother and from Juan also, Dr. Maldonado from LCC, and it really it's just motivating, and you can't. I just want to finish, and not just for myself, but for my family and for my people, so I could help everybody. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you again to the faculty and the students for their work, and thank you for coming and being on our panel. We presented you with some small token of our appreciation for being part of our panel, again, of our conference and your contributions. I'd like to have George come up. He has a couple of housekeeping announcements before we dismiss you guys, so you can please be patient with us and hear him out.